So we are back with Old Britannia, and we're going to be covering his videos regarding the Austrian Empire slash Habsburg's family. Um, Overall, yeah, I do know about the historical significance of the Habsburg and that they are one of the most powerful families to have ever existed. And a lot of Europe was through them. I had heard that a lot of Europe was under their power, mainly through their great marriage alliances and diplomacy. And, I have kind of clowned on them in the past, I'll admit, mainly because the main exposure we have with the Habsburg slash Austrian Empire is the Napoleonic era and the videos we watched from Epic History, and as we saw, they got their butts kicked every video. But obviously, that's me just kind of having fun and joking around, even though they did actually lose a lot, but a lot of clowning on my part. But I actually do, all jokes aside, I am really interested in this family, and I have been meaning to get to these videos. I do find Old Britannia to personally be probably the most thorough historical YouTuber that I've seen on this channel. All the videos he covered, especially his Napoleon videos, are the most detailed. He covered all the bases between what was going on in France, Britain, and all around. And I just think he's really the most thorough and most informative YouTuber I've seen. So, yeah, overall, that's kind of what I associate him with, and I'm really looking forward to learning more about the Habsburgs and, what's going on with them. So I think we should probably just get to it. Let's watch the Habsburg's Empire, 1740 to 1765 by Old Britannia.
In 1740, Charles VI, Holy Roman Emperor, Archduke of Austria, King of Hungary, Croatia and Bohemia, Duke of Luxembourg, Brabant and Milan, passed away. With him went the House of Habsburg. The pot of mushrooms which changed the course of history, Voltaire commented on Charles's apparently fatal Last Supper. Sole occupants of the Holy Roman Empire's imperial throne for 300 years, the dynasty's male line was now extinct. For a family that collected titles as others do souvenirs, this posed a problem. Both Charles and his predecessor Joseph had only sired daughters, by law barred from inheriting the eclectic mix of Habsburg lands or being elected to the imperial throne which presided over the German principalities. Knowing the alternative then was to have this sprawling European empire partitioned by rival claimants, Charles resorted to a creative solution known as the Pragmatic Sanction. This document, overturning Habsburg law and tradition, made his future daughter Maria Theresa the heir to the Habsburg monarchy. Even the imperial throne, held via election rather than inheritance, was to be de facto retained by having Maria Theresa's husband, Francis, take the title. In theory, the Pragmatic Sanction was an ingenious solution that saved what was to become the new House of Habsburg-Lorraine from obliteration. Practically though, this scrap of paper offered very little protection.
Learn heating and cooling
for a series of, sometimes.
So that's already interesting. Like I said, I'm going to be a little more quiet than usual because I'm not going to pretend that I'm very well educated on the Habsburgs or that I could even name a lot of its history. I'm very ignorant overall of its history, though I will say that was interesting, and I do find it, obviously, we know in history a lot of the times, women weren't the inheritors or, the one to take the reins. I usually revolved around, the men, though I do like that solution because it did kind of let, a female member of the Habsburg continue on, even though it technically fell on her husband. But you know what I mean. I feel like, well, you have direct descendants. It would be, obviously that's just the way a lot of history worked in the past, but it's almost unfair that it should all just go to waste, just cut. I mean, you have, direct descendants, it's just they happen to be women, so oh well, I guess now we have to partition everything just because none of them were male. I don't know, I kind of like that solution because in a weird way it worked around it. So again, ingenious is definitely the optimal word for Old Britannia.
Times quite major concessions to the European powers, Charles gained nothing but promises of support for Maria Theresa. Eugene of Savoy, martial hero of the empire, had suggested that a full treasury and strong army would be better than signatures. Charles provided neither. After expending so much effort on confirming his daughter's inheritance, the emperor did almost nothing else to secure it. Maria Theresa was not allowed to take part in the function of government to any serious degree, nor was she given the traditional education of a Habsburg heir. This was in part perhaps due to the expectation she would defer to her husband, but it's also likely that Charles, though very fond of his daughter and keen to secure her succession, continued to hope by some miracle for a son, and thus could never quite see Maria Theresa as his heir. Still, had she been bequeathed
okay, that's beyond interesting. I kind of agree with what he said. A strong treasury and a good army, oftentimes in history, much better than paper. Well, a lot of examples I can think of. Not all the time, but yeah, I think at this moment, yeah, having those two things would definitely be more of an asset. But yeah, I feel like that's a little, how do you say, like, I kind of did like what he did and managed to get that to his daughter, but at the same time, like, I feel like he didn't go fully all the way only because of what he just said right now. You know, he gave her that, but he didn't help secure her, so I feel like you should have gone all the way. Then again, I know, it's like the stigma of the past, you know. Powerful women, it wasn't the norm, to say, when you look back in a lot of history in a lot of areas, you know. It always fell to the males, you know, so, oh well.
The functioning state, not requiring any great leadership, this could have been excused. Yet, again, having spent so much prestige ensuring the Habsburg monarchy would remain intact after his death, in life Charles allowed it to decay to the extent its partition by the more vigorous powers of Europe seemed like an inevitability. In 1740, the government was in disrepair, the military hollowed out, state finances frittered away on senseless wars. The emperor himself, though, still seemed remarkably unconcerned by the
I've never seen old Britannia make like kind of like a meme like that. That's hilarious. Charles, after making sure his daughter inherits the most dysfunctional. You know, now I'm thinking about it, maybe the partition would have been better. Like now, I think the best part is I guess he ensures the Habsburgs go on, but like they're not in a good position. Holy crap.
inheritance he was about to offer his daughter. On the 20th of October, Charles VI finally died, and Maria Theresa was proclaimed the new regnant throughout lands from Belgium to Transylvania. Acquired by treaty and marriage over several hundred years, this disunited monarchy, often referred to as Austria for practical purposes, with its separate laws, parliaments, nobilities and language.
Yeah, I watched a History Matters video about Austria and like it's called The Rise and Fall of the Austrian/Hungary, well no, more like Hungarian Empire. And what I found interesting is just how like Austria was like a multinational ethnical empire, and you know, like I think what he mentioned is that a lot of the Austrian monarchs had to go directly and basically ask for help from like an area like Hungary, like ask, can you help us? Like almost like not a direct command, it's more of a request, which is interesting. And you know, you do eventually see, I remember in that video, eventually, you know, the empire breaks apart. They changed it from just the Austrian Empire to the Austrian-Hungarian Empire to appease Hungary. But as we know, in due time, eventually Hungary broke away. And, you know, yeah, I think that's kind of the problem with such a vast, national empire. You know, some parts just inevitably kind of want to break free, I think. And that's kind of what happened with Austria and Hungary. And I just find it so interesting just how separated some pieces are. Like, the Netherlands is all the way over here across other places, not technically under at least a part of the official empire map like this. It's just like, I don't know, like, I'm just thinking, how do you rule that? I don't know, it's just logistics, you know, when everything's connected, it's like, yeah, that's cool, but, you know, when it's all sparsed out, I don't know, I just find that interesting.
It was a difficult inheritance at the best of times, but in 1740, the Habsburg Empire faced its greatest threat since the Turks had been sighted outside Vienna nearly 60 years earlier. Within weeks, Maria Theresa's succession was challenged by the also recently enthroned Frederick of Prussia. A signatory of the Pragmatic Sanction, though arguably under terms Austria had not honoured, Berlin offered to accept Maria Theresa's accession and support Francis Stephen's candidature for the imperial throne, to which the German princes still had to elect him, if she would only cede part of Silesia. In hindsight, Maria Theresa would probably have done well to accept. The recent line of Hohenzollern kings had been competent opposites of their Habsburg counterparts, bequeathing to Frederick a united, well-governed and financially sound state, with the best trained army on the continent. But the new queen rejected the Prussian king's overtures. Not only was this blatant bullying from a lesser power and a man her father had once helped protect, making a concession such as this would open the way for others. It was hardly like Prussia alone had claims on the empire. The kings of Bavaria and Saxony were married to Joseph I's daughters, who had been passed over for the inheritance by the Pragmatic Sanction. Spain wished to retake the Italian territories it had recently lost, whilst France had long coveted the rich provinces known as the Austrian Netherlands. Conceding Silesia to Prussia, reasoned Maria Theresa, could set off a chain reaction.
I agree. It's the pushover effect, I think, is that, you know, once you say yes to someone, it's kind of like when you win, like, when you win the lottery. Not that I know how that feels, but, like, if you won the lottery and then everyone figured out you gave some to someone, and then, like, everyone else would come and ask, like, you know what I mean? Except this is more like everyone else would bully. Like, you know, like, oh, you know, you conceded that, now, you know, concede us, and it's like, especially with the position that they're in, yeah, I can see that, though, like, I can understand that. Dude, I kind of feel bad for Maria. She's, like, in a bad position. Like, what the fudge? Like, but, now she has to deal with, you know, not looking weak or like a pushover. But then again, that also creates its own problems, in that if you have someone already aggressive enough to make that demand, you might have someone aggressive enough to just straight up jump you or attack you. So yeah.
As it was, obstinacy had much the same effect. In December 1740, before Frederick's offer had even reached Vienna, Prussian troops crossed the border. By the following year, France, Bavaria and Saxony had also aligned against the new Austrian Archduchess. All of the sanctions and signatures in the world would not save Maria Theresa's throne. Now only arms could. But what arms did Austria have? The treasury was empty, the military in disrepair, the monarchy's last great soldier.
Yeah, again, it's that quote that came back earlier that he said, you know, a full treasury and a great army will do much better at this position. And yeah, definitely there is a place and time for, you know, signatures and treaties and whatnot, but there's also times where you just need military force, you know. I think there should be a balance between the two. Obviously, you know, just relying solely on military force, you have a Napoleon, which won't work out in the long run. And, you know, being weak and only trying to rely on trees and stuff, eventually you'll come across someone who won't respect that, and you'll have to fight. So I feel like, ideally, you should have a bit of both, being good standing in both areas, you know what I mean? So yeah, I don't know.
Eugene of Savoy, long dead. To her aid came the Habsburgs' traditional ally, England. Alienated since the War of the Spanish Succession, London was under no obligation to pull Vienna's chestnuts out of the fire, and to start with reacted cautiously. But the thought of a Habsburg partition, and France gazing at Dover from Belgium with no continental rival, was a prospect horrifying enough to tear the country from its policy of neutrality. In 1741,
of course, France getting powerful, nothing scares the British more. It's always that, huh? The British see that, like, we have to stop France from getting more powerful. The entire Napoleonic Wars was Britain doing that. Ew, I spit. But like, yeah.
they agreed to subsidise Maria Theresa with the money needed to defend her inheritance. The Dutch, France's perennial foe, also pledged aid. But for a time it seemed like this might not be enough. At the head of his already powerful army, Frederick proved to be an unnatural military talent, even if his first great victory was won only after he had fled the field.
Well, that's interesting. He is called Frederick the Great after all. And we will be covering his series in the future, House of War, Frederick the Great. It's like a 7-hour long video, so you know, that's gonna be fun. But now that I'm gonna watch it all at once, or like upload it all at once, that's a nightmare. Obviously, it's gonna have to be in like parts, but you know, he is someone we will cover in the future. But yeah, I've heard of his fame prowess. You don't get the name the Great by doing nothing in life, so already one of the most renowned geniuses in the military, in the field of like military arms, is against this weakened Austria. And Maria has to deal with that. Like, what an awful position she got put in. Like, what the fudge, man? Like, are you kidding me?
In panic. Within 7 weeks, Prussia had overrun almost all of Silesia. In France, Marshal de Saxe, a man as base in personal morals as he was brilliant in battle, likewise showed himself to be an extraordinary strategic mind. In late 1741, he marched across Germany and seized Prague, capital of Bohemia. There, Charles of Bavaria, who claimed the inheritance through his wife, crowned himself king. The next year, in a particularly devastating blow to Habsburg prestige, he broke Austria's 300-year rule over the Holy Roman Empire and was elected to the imperial throne. This crown no longer wielded the vast influence of centuries prior, but the election of a Wittelsbach offered a very clear confirmation of Austrian weakness. Frederick took particular glee in referring to Maria Theresa simply as a queen rather than empress. In the face of this, it looked for a moment like
so
the Habsburg monarchy might actually collapse. The Bohemian nobility, despite owing almost everything they had to the Habsburgs, largely supported Charles's coronation. It was not unthinkable that other kingdoms would follow suit. There was only one territory that could prevent this possibility and save Maria Theresa's throne. In September 1741, she arrived at Pressburg to appeal personally to the Diet of Hungarian nobles. The Habsburg
That's what I'm talking about. Like, I'm glad I did watch that Habsburg video by History Matters. I did it on my own time. There's no reaction to it. But, you know, like, yeah, like they had to appeal to a part of their empire, which is just interesting to me. It goes to show you, like, just how powerful of a force Hungary is. You know, I had a thought. I wonder if Napoleon should have ever, like, divided Austria. Like, try to encourage Hungarian independence. I don't know if that would have worked. Probably not, but, like, I don't know. I'm sorry, I don't know why I brought it back to Napoleon, but I was always like, no, that's an interesting aspect if you needed to completely cripple Austria further than he already did during his time, you know, try to divide it by allow the various ethnic, parts to have its own independence, you know. I don't know, that's just a thought. But either way, yeah, Hungary.
Relationship with the land they had liberated from the Turks had always been fractious. The Magyars were proud and independent, not easily disposed to rule from Vienna. Addressing the Diet in Latin, her initial appeals for aid received nothing but scorn. Better apply to Satan than the Hungarians for help, yelled someone. Undeterred, she allowed the Hungarians to ask questions freely, and responded with surprising eloquence, soothing their concerns, granting concessions where needed. Finally, the young queen picked up her infant son and heir Joseph and held him aloft before the Diet. In tears, she consigned the safety of the future king to Hungary. Leaping from their
Again, she's a very sympathetic figure, ain't she? Obviously put in one of the worst positions and having, but you know, drastic times call for drastic measures, and you need Hungary. And it is interesting, I said, just the whole dynamic. That's probably the coolest part I found when I watched the video regarding this relationship. You know, the fact that Hungary could just be like, yeah, no, we don't want to, we have enough. And it's like, it kind of challenges, like, yeah, you're a part of the empire, but you're also strong enough to just say heck no. Which is just an interesting dynamic.
Chairs, the Magyars drew their swords and declared they would die for Maria Theresa, promising her 100,000 soldiers.
I'll do my best.
It was perhaps the only time a Habsburg monarch had so directly faced their subjects and carried them through sheer personal magnetism. Less than a year after ascending the throne, it immediately marked Maria Theresa out as a great woman and a great queen. Even so, Hungarian aid alone could not reverse the disastrous strategic situation of 1742. At British prodding, to avoid a complete dissolution of the monarchy, Maria Theresa agreed to cede most of Silesia to Frederick. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but it saved the Habsburg monarchy. Freed from the risk of imminent collapse by the withdrawal of Prussian troops, the Austrian military effort improved, rolling back the hostile alliance's victories in Bohemia and Germany. Charles, who had once thought of parading through Vienna, now had to abandon his own capital as Habsburg troops swept into Bavaria. The good news was not universal. Under de Saxe, the French invaded the Austrian Netherlands in 1744. Within 2 years, the territory was largely overrun, whilst Austrian successes in Germany convinced Frederick to once again enter the war, making rapid progress through Bohemia. As it had throughout history, shrewd Habsburg diplomacy came to their rescue, convincing the Saxons, never fond of Frederick, to switch sides. The dangerously exposed Prussian army was forced to retreat back to Silesia. Even more hopefully, the hostile coalition was clearly fraying. Frederick accused the French of failing to support his attack through Bohemia. Versailles snorted that they were hardly willing to take lectures from the man who'd abandoned them for a separate peace not 2 years earlier. A Royal Navy blockade was strangling French trade, and in January 1745, Charles, Holy Roman Emperor, died. The Bavarians, largely still occupied after a back and forth, abandoned the struggle in April. There was thus no serious candidate to oppose Francis Stephen, who was elected in September that year to the imperial throne. The Austrians, after near total collapse in 1742, occupied by mid-1745 a very strong position. If either Britain or the Habsburgs had possessed the previous generation of soldiers, a Marlborough or a Eugene, decisive victory was there for the taking. But the talent was all on the coalition's side. Frederick continued to defend Silesia, de Saxe overran Belgium. In 1748, with both sides exhausted, peace talks, which had been conducted sporadically for 2 years, finally made progress. But the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, signed in October, was effectively decided between Britain and France, and then presented as a fait accompli to everyone else. The confirmation of Prussia's control over Silesia left Maria Theresa feeling slighted by her ally. Whilst there was some justification for annoyance at British perfidy, the grudge she subsequently bore London was hardly commensurate with the blood and treasure the country had spilt for the Habsburgs' sake. The only reason the Austrian Netherlands did not go the way of Silesia was because of American colonists on the other side of the world organising the capture of Louisbourg. Nonetheless, despite the loss of Silesia and some minor Italian provinces, Maria Theresa had survived her greatest test. The remaining
Agreed, that was such an awful position, you know? Like, she inherited a really crappy... Well, the empire was in a crappy state. I mean, that it's crappy, but it wasn't a crappy state. Has to go against great generals such as Frederick the Great, you know, is losing it. The fact that this is even there is kind of a miracle, though I can understand her anger towards having to give up any part, but at least you still have all that, so I think that's good. You survived, you know, which is probably more than originally thought, so either way, like, holding it down, Maria.
Were loyal, Europe now recognised her right to rule. For the first time, she could begin to organise her empire. Who was this woman that had inherited a bankrupt and derelict monarchy, was dismissed because of her gender, expected to fail even by her own advisors, and yet defied the greatest powers on the European continent? In 1748, Maria Theresa was 32 years old, with clear blue eyes, abundant corn-coloured hair, and, despite by then having borne the majority of her 16 eventual children, still described as a beauty. Having grown up in seclusion, taught mainly to fulfil the duties of a wife, mother, and lady rather than queen and empress, she never pretended to be the most educated of monarchs. Intellectually, she was ill at ease in the burgeoning Enlightenment, and, despite the unique circumstances of her succession, could overcome inherited prejudices only slowly and partly. Yet she had a practical mind, sound perception, a warm heart, and resolution. She was open to new ideas and prepared to yield to competent advisors. Her husband, the affable and well-meaning Francis Stephen, was technically co-ruler, but showed little interest in or serious capacity for the position, and Maria Theresa tightly held the reins of government until his death. It was well she did so. At her accession, she had no Melbourne, who guided the young Victoria a century later, and it would take her a decade to find the equivalent of a Disraeli. All she had was a gerontocracy of her father's old advisors, more interested in simply being on the winning side of any succession war than governing. The Chancellor, Seinzendorf, seemed to be working for every power except Austria, and regularly confused political scheming with actual policy. In spite of this inauspicious start, Maria Theresa would, throughout her life, maintain a knack for choosing sound advisors when she finally got the chance. Her first pick though, Johann Bartenstein, was not one of them. This small, conceited, argumentative little man with the tight mouth and popping eyes did not endear himself to the British in particular. He was, however, forthright and experienced, qualities that were sorely needed by a queen with no prior knowledge of international diplomacy. A better decision was to keep on Count Starhemberg, unfortunately decrepit, but also honest and loyal with a good financial mind. The man she chose to be her most trusted advisor was of all people a minor Portuguese noble, known as the Count of Tarouca. Clever and devoted, he taught Maria Theresa the business of government in these early years of her reign. How to think, organise her days, manage her ministers, and most importantly,
Again, there's a lot I'm admiring about Maria. Obviously, I think it's good that she really wants to learn the aspects of ruling. You know, obviously she wants to do a good job, and like the best thing you can do is surround yourself with as many good advisors as you can, which is a great aspect, and listening to wiser people in different areas, you know, which is what a lot of, you know, I think ideally a lot of empires should, or kingdoms should be like. You know, obviously one person, well, you might have a king who's great at everything, but sometimes a king might be, or a monarch might be less knowledgeable about a certain area, so you have an expert in that area, you know. So I think that's a very admirable trait she wants to learn. She recognizes that there's a lot she has to learn and is more than willing to learn and call on, you know, people to help her. I think that's one of the best traits you can have as a monarch. So overall, good on you, man. Woman, or should I say.
he gave her the self-confidence to believe that she was worthy of the Habsburg inheritance. In Edward Crankshaw's words, she was to offer the world an example of what may be achieved by an individual of moderate, peaceable and benevolent temperament, standing up against the greed of violent and ambitious men, and the impatience of doctrinaire idealists. For 8 years following the Peace of Aix-la-Chapelle, Maria Theresa devoted herself to the reorganization of the Habsburg monarchy. This pan-European state was not a country, nor was it really an empire, and it was not officially known as such until half a century later. The disparate collection of Germans, Magyars, Romanians, Czechs, Italians, Flemings and Slavs were united only by the House of Austria. Maria Theresa was determined to organise them for the first time into a unified state. The area in most pressing need of reform was of course the army. Upon Maria Theresa's accession, it had theoretically contained 160,000 troops, though, as she bitterly discovered, the reality was far less. The new queen moved quickly to regenerate it as best she could in a time of war, but initial attempts only served to prove how deep the rot was. Amnesties were granted to senior commanders that had been thrown in jail for their part in her father's failed wars. At some other point in history, this bit of statesmanship may have been rewarded with the loyalty it deserved, but as was to become a trend, such imagination had a way of boomeranging around so as to smack the Habsburgs in the jaw. Almost all of the released officers repaid the new queen by offering their services to her enemies. The only significant soldier of those freed that remained loyal and willing to serve, Marshal Neipperg, turned out to be of more use to the Prussians than the Austrians in command. Maria Theresa did not despair, but she knew the time allotted to her by the Peace of 1748 had to be used wisely if Austria were to ever match Prussia on the battlefield. New military schools were established for officers, of which the Engineering Academy in Vienna was a particular highlight. Regular army manoeuvres were now to be held, the military frontiers, from which many of Austria's finest soldiers came, were reorganised. Prince Liechtenstein instituted far-reaching reforms of the artillery. So enamoured was he with Maria Theresa that he did so partly out of his own pocket. The largely ad hoc enlistment process based around the estates was replaced with a system of regular conscription, ordered by a central authority. In sum, the Austrian military as it was to exist for the next century and a half was created by Maria Theresa. Military improvements alone could not save the Habsburg monarchy.
Wow, that is beyond interesting. I didn't even know who this woman was before this video. I didn't even know she existed. But seeing just how important she was to everything, really already like super interesting. I just find that really unique, a really unique figure. You know, like we don't cover many powerful women on this channel. It's usually always just guys, you know. But that's why when you see a woman, like it stands out more, you know what I mean? So yeah, already like a huge fan right here of what she's doing.
As it was in 1748, however, the whole financial and political order of the empire was in need of a revolution. The man Maria Theresa picked to help her this time was yet another minor noble from relative obscurity, in the shape of Wilhelm, Count Haugwitz. His job was to forge a centralised administration out of the feudal hodgepodge that made up the empire, bringing some cohesion to a system dominated by provincial estates of landowners. This he did with vigour, though not without opposition. The nobility resisted fiercely at times, even other ministers complained. It was once again Maria Theresa, almost alone, that supported Haugwitz faithfully. As he pushed through reforms that stripped ancient privileges from the aristocracy, imposed taxes upon them for the first time, and gave central bureaucrats a previously unheard of reach, the Queen took it upon herself to see they were implemented, persuading the grandees personally, allowing them to speak against the changes if need be, but never deviating from them. Maria Theresa also displayed her talent for picking competent subordinates in the field of education. Gerhard van Swieten had made his reputation as a physician in the Netherlands when he was called to Vienna by the Queen. Her initial introduction to this doctor, that in appearance looked more like he belonged on a watch list than in the capital, had not been in the most encouraging of circumstances. As physician to Maria Theresa's only sister, then in the Austrian Netherlands, he had failed to save her life. It spoke either to the Queen's open-mindedness, or an unbeknownst hatred for her sister, that van Swieten was still called to Vienna for an audience with Maria Theresa. Impressed, he was first made her personal physician, and then tasked with helping reorganise Austrian medical education. Under his stewardship, the Jesuit-ridden society of the monarchy was launched into the Enlightenment. This was not at all in line with Maria Theresa's natural inclinations. As always, however, she was open-minded, and stood by the reforms in everything from medical examinations to the running of hospitals.
As someone who learned English as a second language,
In by van Swieten in the face of Jesuit criticism. It should of course be acknowledged that whilst these reforms were perhaps radical for the Habsburg Empire, compared to those of other so-called enlightened despots, including her own son, Maria Theresa's adjustments were not a serious break with Austrian traditions or law. She had no desire to curtail the traditional power of the estates any more than was necessary, only to ensure that they pulled their own weight. Indeed, in some cases, such as that of Hungary, resistance was fierce enough that the magnates were able to escape the scythe of reform. The Jesuits, though not allowed to get in the way of Van Swieten's work, were never abused or suppressed by the Queen as happened under other Enlightenment-era rulers. Yet neither should the scale of the changes be underestimated. Van Swieten helped, sometimes dragged Vienna into the Enlightenment, and within a few years, Haugwitz had created a centralised bureaucracy, treasury and army. Maria Theresa had given the Habsburg monarchy a coherence it had seldom ever shown before. It was an advantage she did not intend to waste. In many ways, these reforms were an end to themselves for the Queen, creating a more united and powerful monarchy that she could bequeath to her son, but they also served a purpose of calibrating Austria towards the one goal Maria Theresa never lost sight of, the reclamation of Silesia. By 1755, she felt her realm was ready to take back the province so painfully stripped from her inheritance, but to do so she needed allies. The Queen still held a grudge against Britain for making her abandon the territory originally, and she never forgave them for concluding a non-aggression pact with Frederick in 1756. Austrian finances were not so great that they could forego the wartime subsidy of a commercial power, however. The alternative solution was provided by the defining statesman of the era, Kaunitz. A native Austrian, after a series of diplomatic postings, Kaunitz established his reputation as Habsburg delegate to Aix-la-Chapelle in 1748, where he had steered Austrian policy shrewdly in a thankless position. Intelligent, hard-working and charming, with brilliant instincts, of all Maria Theresa's servants, Kaunitz was the most important. Ironically, he was least like the Queen in personality. An atheist, womanizer, vain, greedy, with supreme arrogance tempered only by an extreme hypochondria. Yet he was to wield more power than any Habsburg minister in history. Believing that the rise of Prussia had invalidated Eugene's grand strategic conception of an Anglo-Austrian alliance focused on France, Kaunitz was in agreement with Maria Theresa that the union with London should not be renewed. His suggestion for what should replace it, however, was very radical indeed. Austria, Kaunitz declared, should now actually look towards France for an alternative alliance. A lesser monarch might have dismissed the plan immediately. Versailles was Vienna's historic rival in Europe. Burying a 300-year-old hatchet was hardly simple. Indeed, when Kaunitz first presented his ideas in 1749, Maria Theresa's advisors had just unanimously supported reaffirming the British connection. Yet the Queen was, as ever, open-minded in matters of strategy, and impressed by this still young man's boldness. Indeed, she quickly came round to the advantages of a treaty with France. If it would secure the Low Countries from attack, all of Austria's attention could be focused upon Prussia. With French subsidy, Vienna could afford to fight the war without British aid. Even from a purely ideological viewpoint, Catholic and autocratic France was a more natural partner than heretical and dangerously liberal Britain. Thus, in 1750, Kaunitz himself was sent to Versailles with the intention of sounding out the Bourbons. The 3-year mission did not achieve any striking change in French thinking, but Kaunitz had seeded the idea in the mind of Louis XV's favourite mistress, Madame de Pompadour, then at the summit of her influence. Recalled to Vienna in 1753, Kaunitz was made Chancellor, that is to say First Minister, of the whole empire. Bartenstein was also nudged out of foreign affairs to make way for the coming man. Above Kaunitz there was now only the Queen and God, and Kaunitz did not believe in God. Contrary to legend, as Crankshaw says, he was not the greatest of chancellors. He lacked the genius of Bismarck or the wisdom of Salisbury. Even the subtlety of Metternich was deficient. He tended to focus doggedly on one goal and drive relentlessly towards it, ignoring the wider picture. And in Prussia he had found his muse. In 1756, Britain and France were once again at war, competing for trade and colonial prizes in the New World. Neither initially thought of expanding the conflict into Europe, but the struggle offered Kaunitz the opportunity he had been waiting for. Fearing a French attack on George II's personal fiefdom of Hanover, the British concluded with Frederick a non-aggression pact, which also committed them to jointly oppose the passage of any foreign, that is to say French or Russian, troops in Germany. Versailles was furious at their allies' double-dealing. Frederick responded that the treaty was merely defensive and not intended as a provocation. Having been given assurances earlier that France had no plans to march on Hanover, Frederick believed the agreement with London had broken up a possible hostile coalition of Britain, Austria and Russia, without having to actually honour this new commitment to oppose Versailles. In this calculation, he had not reckoned with Kaunitz. The Austrian Chancellor immediately realised that the Convention of Westminster offered him the opening he needed. Louis XV, never fond of Frederick, but now actively hostile to him, listened to Pompadour's advice and agreed to negotiations. The result was the Treaty of Versailles. In detail a fairly mundane defensive alliance, but among the great powers it sparked a revolution. Neither the British or the Prussians had intended to drop their former alliances completely. Only now did they realise with horror what had happened. Even worse,
This is so unique, I find. Like, again, what Kaunitz has proposed between this whole alliance between Austria and France is so, like, again, out of the box thinking, right? But, like, the fact that it's almost coming into fruition, I think is so unique. And just, yeah, the strategic, possibilities of not having to worry about the Netherlands, being able to focus, because ideally in war you don't want a lot of fronts open, you know. So having less fronts open and being able to just focus on one enemy is always more ideal. I know peers of emperors would like disagree with that, but like, you know, that's just like how I see it. And this is I think a very interesting dynamic. And again, I think open-mindedness is another great aspect that monarchs should have, and the fact that, you know, Maria has it speaks a lot of volumes, you know, because it is such an important aspect, and it allows opportunities like this to flourish, I think. And once again, the Habsburgs, I do know they were very diplomatic. They use diplomacy greatly, and it's kind of cool to see that, you know. So yeah.
The Russian Tsarina Elizabeth also joined this burgeoning coalition, annoyed by the implications of the convention, which seemed to be partly aimed at her, and always distrustful of Prussian intentions anyway. Kaunitz was able to secure her cooperation in January 1757. Even before the Russian treaty was official, Frederick, well informed by his spies, knew what the Austrian game was. He could hardly have thought otherwise when he received only evasive replies from Maria Theresa as to whether she intended peace. Not content to await their destruction, in classic fashion the Prussians struck first. On the 29th of August 1756, without a declaration of war, Frederick invaded Saxony, whom he suspected to be in league with the Austrians. He offered to withdraw his troops in return for the Queen's word that she would not attack him. Instead, the usually amiable Francis denounced the king as a scoundrel with no respect for international law, and called on Europe to help defeat the unprovoked aggression. The assertion that Frederick was to solely blame for the war was a dubious one, but Europe generally agreed with the Habsburgs.
He really kind of fed them a great little lie there, huh? Well, you know, at least he definitely gave them a reason to look more like an excuse to make him look like a bigger villain, right? And yeah, just holy crap. How the tables turn, huh? And how the use of diplomacy is getting everyone to jump on frickin' Prussia, small Prussia here. Wow.
Louis XV, until then not wholly convinced by the Austrian alliance, was suddenly its greatest supporter. In the Second Treaty of Versailles, he in effect agreed that the defeat of Prussia, not Britain, would be his primary war goal. As compensation, the Austrians were to give up the Low Countries, though only after Berlin's defeat. This was felt to be a worthy trade. The financial loss of Belgium would be offset by Silesia's return, whilst the Habsburgs would have a freer hand to consolidate Germany than they had possessed since the days of Charles V. Kaunitz very nearly achieved the Prussian king's complete encirclement by offering to leave George II's beloved electorate of Hanover inviolate if only he would abandon Berlin to its fate. In this, he was thwarted by Britain's new warlord William Pitt, who was to prove an annoyingly steadfast ally of the Prussians. Nonetheless, in 1757, Kaunitz could reasonably claim to have done all that was possible diplomatically. The hunter of the previous war had now become the hunted. Why then, in 1763, when peace was once again concluded, did Austria remain without Silesia? As in any conflict, the factors range from luck to incompetence to genius. Firstly, Frederick remained the greatest military mind of the age. After an initial faulty start when Austrian forces basically defeated him at Lobositz, and then with more certainty at Kolin, on the 5th of November 1757, the Prussian king smashed a French army at Rossbach before wheeling around to defeat a Habsburg force nearly twice as large a month later. That battle was a masterpiece, Napoleon later said of Leuthen. Frederick was not invincible and could lose battles, sometimes decisively, as at Kunersdorf in 1759. Yet compared to his genius, what did the Austrians have? Loudon was probably the most able commander, but he was highly competent rather than brilliant. Brown was an admirable talent, but killed too early for a fair assessment. Maria Theresa simply never found her Eugene on the battlefield. Then there was the fact that in an era when armies rarely exceeded 100,000 men for reasons of supply, the overwhelming theoretical numbers of the Austro-French-Russian coalition could be partly offset by Frederick's better quality troops and interior lines, allowing him to defeat each in detail. As always, there were the usual problems with coalition warfare. Three great powers, often at odds with one another, was hardly a recipe for unified strategy. After their defeat at Rossbach, the French decided to focus on the British, and hardly saw another Prussian for the rest of the war, a fact confirmed with the Third Treaty of Versailles in 1758, which relieved Louis of his commitment to that theatre. Russia proved a frustrating enemy for Frederick, but rarely cooperated with the Austrians in full, refusing, for example, to follow up their great joint victory at Kunersdorf, partly because they believed it would render undue assistance to the Habsburg cause. Even so, by 1762, Silesia was effectively in Austrian hands. Frederick's manpower was as exhausted as the king himself, whilst the British, having won their parallel conflict with France, and ousted Pitt from government, were demanding the Prussians cede at least part of the territory. The final factor that doomed the Habsburg cause then was luck, an element this house seems to have exhausted its supply of since the winged hussars arrived just in time to relieve Vienna from the Turks. In 1762, the Prussophobe Empress Elizabeth of Russia died, replaced by the almost comically Prussophile Peter, who immediately made peace with Frederick and gave him the use of a Russian corps. Of all the traits required to be a Russian Tsar, sanity was not one of them, but this decision was too much even for the court of St. Petersburg, and Peter was soon after deposed by his wife, Catherine. Yet the damage was done. Suddenly free from other threats, the Prussians reconquered Silesia, and then offered peace. Strategically, the war did not harm the Habsburg cause in the medium term. Frederick's state had emerged intact from the struggle, but the king's aggressive spirit was broken. In the longer run, however, the survival...
That's amazing that Prussia just got out of that. Like, holy crap. Goes to show you the genius of Frederick, right? But, yeah, it also backfired. Like, they didn't get what they wanted, the Habsburgs, so I guess you can kind of see that as a failure, right?
Russia, united with one of the continent's richest provinces, left a sharp thorn in the Austrian side, and eventually a new challenger for primacy in Germany. Writing to Voltaire just after Charles VI's death in 1740, Frederick had declared, "I believe there will be, by June next, more talk of cannon, soldiers, trenches than of actresses and dancers for the ballet." This small event changes the entire system of Europe. It is the little stone which Nebuchadnezzar saw in his dream, loosening itself and rolling down on the image made of the four metals, which it shivers in ruins. He saw far. From this act in 1740 flowed Königgrätz, Sedan, and everything since. When peace was signed at Hubertusburg in 1763 though, that was a long way off. Maria Theresa resigned herself to the loss of Silesia. Kaunitz's great gamble had failed, but Austria had shown itself to be once more a military and diplomatic power on the European continent. This was of little consolation to the Queen, who had been genuinely appalled by the slaughter that she had had a hand in bringing about, all in the end for naught. She did not react bitterly or heap blame on anyone. Kaunitz retained her full confidence. Daun kept the heroic status he had won at Kolin, but from now on there would be no more wars of conquest, if she could help it, no more compromises with her Christian faith in matters of policy. Or so she believed. These principles were to be violently put to the test for the last part of her reign, for Maria Theresa's until now iron grip on policy was about to be shaken. In 1765, Francis Stephen unexpectedly died, causing a grief in the Queen that would last the rest of her life. She was 48. Despite his numerous infidelities, which regularly tried her patience, no one would have questioned Maria Theresa's almost devouring love for her husband. When a youthful friend once suggested he insist on separate bedrooms, the Queen pursued the individual with such wrath for the rest of his life that Francis never dared to broach the subject again. If Maria Theresa talked of anything outside affairs of state, the topic of conversation was invariably Francis Stephen. The following week saw the Queen devoted entirely to her husband's funeral and memory. It was as if the monarchy, the cause to which she had devoted her life, no longer existed. Into this gap stepped her eldest son and the most enigmatic figure of the era, Joseph II. His reign was to be one of the most transformative and disastrous in Austrian history, but first he would have to contend with his mother, who still remained ruler of the Habsburg monarchy. Maria Theresa had, in 1740, inherited a broken, destitute and dying monarchy. Just over 20 years later, the Habsburg Empire had been re-established as a great, perhaps in 1765 the greatest, power on the European continent. In popular memory, Frederick tends to receive the laurels of this time period, and not without justification. His survival in the 7 Years' War is a heroic tale of courage, yet there is a sense that Frederick was always destined for greatness. He was handed a rising power, strong in almost every conceivable way despite its size, and immediately offered a golden opportunity for territorial expansion. It is to some degree a stain on the Prussian king's record that he ever found himself in the situation of 1762, requiring almost divine providence to rescue him. By contrast, Maria Theresa's ultimate failure to recover Silesia really does seem like a case of the bad luck that was to afflict the Habsburg dynasty for the rest of its existence. Maria Theresa's consolidation of her inheritance was a quieter, more subtle triumph than Pitt or Frederick's great conquest. But a triumph it was. The Habsburg monarchy would go on to have unique, occasionally brilliant sovereigns, but none would ever hold a candle to the great Queen.
Again, mad respect to Maria, like, amazing historical figure who I didn't even know existed until today, in this video. And I think I really do love that we've stuck with the history aspect on this channel. Mainly because, you know, I originally thought I would like branch out to other stuff. Like, history was not the plan when I made this channel, but I'm kind of really glad I stuck with it and that I don't plan on departing from it, because there's so much to learn. I think, you know, I can spend a whole lifetime learning. And yeah, again, like, was put in one of the worst positions ever, and then came out and like handled it like greatly. Overall, nothing but respect for Maria, and I can't wait to learn more about Austria as we continue on tomorrow. Until then, bye everyone.